Welcome, everyone. We will begin today's webinar in just a few moments, but I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone to today's presentation, hosted by the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice, the Future Ocean and Coastal Infrastructure, and the Marine Environmental Observation Prediction and Response Network. My name is Dr. Amber Silver. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security at the University at Albany. I'm also the co-lead for the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice, or CORC. I will be your moderator for today's talk. The Community of Practice is part of FOCI, a collaborative research project administered from the Memorial University of Newfoundland, with the overall objective of identifying and addressing diverse infrastructure needs, as well as problems and opportunities in support of sustainable, safe, and inclusive coastal communities and ocean industries in Atlantic Canada. FOCI is supported primarily by the Ocean Frontier Institute. CORC is also supported by MEOPAR, a national network sponsored by the Strategic Science Fund that links top marine researchers and highly qualified personnel across Canada with partner organizations and communities. The title of today's webinar is Research-Based Lessons for Climate Change Communication with presenter Professor Mark Stoddart. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy by email in about a week. A link to the recording will also be posted on CORC's website. Today's webinar is about an hour long and it's going to include time for questions at the end. Please remember to keep your audio muted and your video off. If you have a question for the presenter, please feel free to enter it in chat at any time during the presentation. You can also use the chat feature to share comments with us and other attendees. Mark, would you be able to share your screen, please? Wonderful. So
Perfect.
we are so happy to welcome Professor Mark Stoddart from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Since 2011, Professor Stoddart has researched the political and media dynamics of climate policy and public debate in Canada. His work has also examined eco-political tensions among offshore oil industry and nature-focused tourism in Newfoundland and Labrador, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Scotland. He's involved in the Future Ocean and Coastal Infrastructures, or FOCI project, concerning safe, sustainable, and inclusive coastal communities and industries for Atlantic Canada. Professor Stoddart is also currently writing a textbook on understanding environmental sociology. Today, Mark will outline a few key research-based suggestions for climate change communication that will hopefully be relevant to your context and perspective. Again, feel free to pose any questions or comments in the chat at any time. You will have a chance to discuss them during the Q&A period following his presentation. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's see, my control bar has disappeared. There he goes. My mic is on. That's always good. Thank you, everybody, for joining today and for the invitation. Sorry, why is this not doing what I want it to do? You pre-test the things, and then you start the things, and they don't do what you want them to do. All right, let's see. Is that looking good, Amber?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for the invitation. Today I'll be basically trying to take away or introduce some kind of high-level lessons from about 15 or more years of working in actually probably more than that now, working in the climate change kind of research space. And I will just start with the takeaway, I think, or what I hope folks will get out of today, is that I think it's quite important to be able to distinguish between the more and the less consensual climate beliefs, public kind of beliefs and opinions, and policy orientations. Because I think making those distinctions between more and less consensual climate policy orientations can help us think maybe more strategically about how to frame climate action or how to build social support for climate action. That's kind of the big overarching takeaway. In terms of the research base that this talk builds upon, kind of comes from two projects, two large and long-term projects. The first one is COMPON, Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks. This is a international project that's been started off around 2007. I've been co-lead of the Canadian team since about 2010, 2011, thereabouts. It's got about, has had about 18 or 20 different case study teams, mostly in North America, Europe, and East Asia for the most part, or in Asia, South Asia as well. It's a project that has looked at climate change media discourse across about 18 different countries, and also climate change policy networks. So not just governmental actors, but also NGOs, scientists, business representatives, etc. Kind of everybody with a vested interest in intervening in climate policy debate and trying to shape climate policy debate. The project as a whole has now been responsible for well over 100 peer-reviewed publications across the different teams. I think probably closer to 150 publications at this point. And with media analysis that stretches back data-wise to about 1997 and continues to be ongoing with new waves of mass media data collection, social media data collection, and so on, and also multiple waves of policy network surveys and data analysis. So that's one kind of the foundations of the kind of lessons I'm kind of teasing out today. The second is the more recent work with FOCI, where I've been working with the work package number 6 on perceptions of climate change. That's part of the tasks for that project have adopted compound research methods to look at climate change media discourse and policy networks in Atlantic Canada. And those are the tasks that I've been more involved in. There's also been a survey of the general public in Atlantic Canada led by Karen Foster at Dalhousie, and also a Delphi kind of process, research process led by Howard Ramos, who's was at Dalhousie, but is now at Western University in Ontario. You'll also see Tomas Ilantila from University of Helsinki, is kind of a good friend and collaborator who's been involved in both of these projects. But these are really the kind of research bases for what I'll be doing today, and the kind of lessons I'll be teasing out. Before we go any further, though, one thing I did want to mention, some of you may find this quite useful. Max Boykoff's book, Creative Climate Communications. Some of the advice he gives, or much of the advice he gives, is kind of similar to a lot of the things I'll be talking about. He's kind of probably one of the main people in the United States doing stuff on climate change and media and climate communications. He's been working on this stuff as well since around 2010 or even earlier. The book is great. It's basically about, how academics and scientists try to communicate climate change to general publics. However, I guess the only caveat is that it does tend to be very American-centric. It's very much about the American context. But if you are looking for something today to read further in this area, I would highly recommend that as a resource. So. All right, just by way of a brief roadmap, I'm going to approach this in kind of 3 different levels or kind of ways, and treat these as kind of lessons, things we might learn from research that might help us, in our kind of climate communication in our own spheres of influence, our own work. And I'm going to start off with Canada in that international context, kind of looking at COMPON a bit and how Canada looks in terms of our climate communication patterns relative to other countries, other parts of the world. We'll break things down then a bit more at the national level, and then finally turn a bit of attention to Atlantic Canada and some of the stuff that's a bit more emerging from the more recent research from FOCI, through FOCI. And then in conclusion, I'll try to draw out some of the implications of these research-based lessons for kind of communication strategies going forward, or how folks maybe can think about making use of some of these these kind of research lessons, based lessons. All right, so let's go first to Canada in the international context. And start off with, I think the first thing we see, and as you'll see, this graph kind of ends in 2010, but it starts in 1997, goes all the way back to the Kyoto Protocol. And this is the news share in kind of national news media, key national news media outlets for climate change. News share is the percentage of all articles published that connect to climate change and have a climate change orientation. So we wouldn't expect this to be super high in any particular country, because obviously news media outlets are covering a ton of different issues. But one thing we see is Canada's consistently been higher visibility for climate change as an issue than a lot of other countries. And that historical pattern that we see there, I think it still holds pretty true. We don't have the full set of comparative data to bring this up to date, but I think we do still see, in the ongoing work I've been doing since then and talking to colleagues, that Canada tends to be at the high end of countries that Compound has worked with in terms of the visibility it's giving climate change. Second thing we might notice here on this graph is that the spikes in media coverage for climate change often tend to align with international or national key political events more than they do with actual ecological change or climate science. So you'll see a bit of a bump here with 1997, with the Kyoto Protocol being a high visibility event. In 2007, that's the year that An Inconvenient Truth came out, that the IPCC and Al Gore got the Nobel Prize. And in 2009, of course, is the Copenhagen COP meetings. And so we see these kind of events really driving a lot of coverage. This 2002 spike in Canada's news media visibility was the year that the Liberal government of the time ratified the Kyoto Protocol. If we were to extend this graph out for Canada, we'd continue to see similar things, that things tend to ebb and flow with either big policy changes in the national government or internationally. So there was a big spike, for example, in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. If we were just to extend to this Canadian trend line out, increasing coverage with some of the Fridays for the Future protests, and then basically things fell off a cliff with COVID, as they did across a lot of the world. One other thing you might find interesting here, if any of you are particularly China watchers, is where China's media visibility to climate change really started spiking around the Copenhagen meetings and has stayed quite high ever since, which is just kind of an interesting aside, because I'm not going to get too much into the Chinese case at the moment. But I think the lesson there really is that we have seen historically, and we continue to, more visibility to climate change as an issue than in a lot of the rest of the world. However, it's not all a good news story, because often what we found in Compound is the places that talk about climate change more in the media often have less consensus and more kind of conflict around the issue. So often the places that have less visibility, it's not because climate change isn't important, it's maybe that it's less conflictual and that there's more of a political consensus around the need to address it. This table here is a cluster analysis of most of the Compound cases, everyone we had data for at the time that this article was published. And basically, we're clustering countries by how much the public discourse accepts the IPCC consensus position, the kind of the scientific consensus, how much the public discourse focuses on global impacts of climate change rather than national or subnational, how much the case focuses on the global political sphere and UN-based systems and processes, and how much there's the kind of public discourse has a pro-mitigation stance. And while we aren't the United States in the sense of the kind of false balance of always putting, climate skepticism or denialism versus climate belief, we do fall into this kind of Anglo eco-politics cluster where we are a little more similar to the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia would tend to fall there as well, where we do have a little more space in our public discussion for kind of climate denialism or skepticism than a lot of other countries do, where we do tend to focus more on internal, like, national or subnational impacts and political discussions rather than the more global or international discussions, and where the public discourse tends to have a less of a, strong kind of pro-mitigation framing than maybe we see in some of the other, kind of European eco-politics clusters or global eco-politics clusters that these other countries tend to make up. For example. So not all kind of good news that we give a lot of attention to climate change, because sometimes it means we're arguing about it more, right? Or giving maybe more space to kind of obstruction or denialism in the kind of media or public sphere. Third lesson that comes from mostly from my friends and colleagues at University of Helsinki who've been studying social media, and they are mostly using Twitter data from before the shift to X and the Elon Musk takeover, and that's a whole other discussion we might get into about the data dumpster fire that X has become versus pre-X Twitter. But the interesting thing that they find is that even in high consensus countries where there's a general consensus around the need for climate action, a general consensus around support for the kind of IPCC scientific consensus, social media really has become a place where climate denialism has proliferated and proliferates and becomes normalized, and a site for issue polarization, even in countries that tend to be high consensus otherwise in their mainstream media and in the mainstream of political discussion. And that they find, Ted Chen and colleagues, that kind of polarization is often linked with issue orientations on other polarizing issues that have, like immigration, for example, or LGBTQIA plus kind of rights. So that basically, as things get more and more polarized in the social media debate, we also tend to see increasing alignment between how you stand on climate change and how you stand on other issues, right? And I'm going to kind of circle back to that at the end. So just kind of hold that thought, hopefully that social media is and that has, as far as we can see, not just polarizing around climate change, but feeding into polarization on a range of related issues increasingly. So that's kind of Canada in the international context. Second thing I'm going to go to is national level climate communication. And I'm not going to hone in too much on these figures. They're social network visualizations. They are kind of snapshots in time from the kind of early days of post-Kyoto climate coverage up to about the middle of the Harper era. And I think what we see that's interesting in this historical evolution is just notice all of these gray circular nodes becoming kind of more numerous as we go through time, slowly, kind of evolving. And each of those gray circular nodes is kind of a theme. It's a way that people are talking about climate change in media communication. So one thing that we see that I think is interesting is that the way we talk about climate change in Canadian public discourse has become increasingly complex over time. We talk about it in a greater number of ways. If we go back to the early post-Kyoto period, it was pretty much, is it happening or isn't it? Is it going to be an economic catastrophe to try to address climate change? And the way we've talked about it has become more sophisticated over time. And that's a trend I think that's largely continued. And to me, that's actually a good news story, that in general, the conversations we're having about climate change have become a bit more nuanced over time. They've been able to embody a bit more complexity over time. Again, however, not all a good news story, because the other thing we see in the evolution of these figures is an increasing divergence between more centrist kind of media and more conservative media. This analysis is of the National Post versus the Globe and Mail, where the two outlets don't look too much different in the early post-Kyoto period, but as the decade evolves, as we get into the Harper era, and we could trace this trend again onwards and stays more or less true up to about 2020, the stuff that's a bit more recent, you do see this kind of divergence of more centrist or liberal or conservative media around the types of ways that climate change is being framed. More conservative media, more likely to give space to climate denialism or obstructionism, more likely to frame things as a climate action versus economic growth, or framing around the economic costs of climate action, whereas more centrist media tending a little more European in the sense that, the starting point tends to be climate change is happening, it needs a response. The debate tends to be around the specific types of responses a bit more, the actual policy orientations, that whether they're good or not, or effective or not, things like that. So really seeing an emergence of, distinct kind of climate communication cultures, depending whether we're talking about more left centrist or conservative media in this country over the last 25 plus years. Lesson 6, I think, is to shift gears or focus a little bit, and maybe another kind of mixed lesson of both optimism and pessimism, is that we do see in our kind of public discourse and in the media in this country that environmental groups and pro-environmental political parties or governments, provincial governments, political parties, have generally been able to gain media visibility and to articulate pro-climate action discourses, and to kind of get that through. The downside of that, however, is I don't think we don't necessarily see that translating into policy influence, that maybe especially when it comes head on into the interests of fossil fuel sectors or pro-business coalitions. So this is another sociogram that I'm not going to get too deep into, other than to show this is kind of a mapping of some of the media discourse, kind of really through again around the 2000s, into the early days of the first half of the Harper government, where we do see groups like the David Suzuki Foundation here. Also some other graphs from that same paper. You'd see Greenpeace, you see Pembina Institute, articulating pro-climate stances, often in alignment with like the government of BC, the government of Ontario or Quebec, the NDP, the Liberal Party when they were in opposition. But when we compare our media analysis to our policy network analysis, we see that those actors don't necessarily, even though they're visible in the media discourse, not necessarily having the most influence on policy orientations and policy action and things like that, right? So a bit of a disconnect between the kind of public conversations that we've seen versus actually being able to translate that into pro-mitigation kind of climate action in a serious way often. Right. All right. And I think lesson 7, which kind of explains part of the reason for that disconnect or that asymmetry, is that if we look at Canadian climate communication really from the Kyoto days of 1997 up through the present, is we see that a lot of decision makers, a lot of governments, a lot of the conversation and the discourse has really been caught between saying that we want to make commitments to the Paris Agreement or other, Kyoto before that, but to international agreements, kind of saying we're kind of pursuing green transitions and trying to do that, versus the persistence of kind of, support for fossil fuel interests, or needing to ensure, kind of the kind of economic well-being or integrity of the fossil fuel sector. And that really gets, I think, stark when we start looking at federal, provincial, how these conversations play out differently at the national level versus the provincial level, where, there's a lot of contention at the provincial level, especially around the carbon tax, carbon pricing in general, and curtailing oil and gas development. So oil exploration and extraction. That we do see going back quite a long time, that these are higher areas of contention that do reflect tensions between, Alberta or Newfoundland and Labrador versus the more, national level conversations, or the provinces that have adopted more of a climate leader kind of positionality, like British Columbia or Quebec, for example. But we do see going back quite a while in our media data that these have been, kind of landmines in the national climate conversation for quite some time. And so maybe not surprising that the carbon tax in particular, for example, has really blown up into the issue that it has done. But there is a but that I think is possibly cause for optimism. Again, to look at some of the more international research that's been done by colleagues in out of view of Helsinki, they see, that there is increasingly an emerging consensus around kind of green growth and renewable transitions that seems to suggest a realignment of the traditional environment versus economy framing, or the pro mitigation versus business kind of sector, business interest kind of blocks around climate action. And they're mostly studying Finland and Australia in this work. I think they've extended it to kind of Sweden as well in this work. So quite different political context than Canada. So I think here it's a bit more of an open question. The With my colleague Dave Tyndall at UBC, he's kind of leading a survey that's rolling out in the next month or two of the Canadian general public. So I think it'll be very interesting to see among the general public, do we see that kind of emerging consensus reflected? Is green growth maybe realigning the climate policy networks, the climate discussion in productive ways? I would say the big but here starts with a T and rhymes with grump. Obviously, the Trump administration has come in with a very obstructionist agenda around climate action. Even before Trump, I think the war in Ukraine as well from the last couple of years has really reignited a lot of concerns about energy security in Europe. So I think what we saw 2 or 3 years ago, or even 4 years ago, around a kind of green growth emerging consensus, I think that question mark around that has gotten much bigger because of just kind of geopolitics, the Ukraine war, Trump, all the kind of volatility and uncertainty we're currently living through. Certainly, if you asked me around 2020 or 2021, I probably would have been much more optimistic about this point than I am this morning. But hopefully, there's enough momentum to this kind of green growth realignment to carry on in the face of some of this volatility. And I'm sure maybe some of our discussion will end up going there as well. All right, to take things down to the Atlantic Canada kind of regional level, lastly, and some of the stuff that I've been working on more in the last 5 years on this kind of thing, on this kind of work on media discourse and policy networks. I think what we see within Atlantic Canada is that there's relatively broad consensus around some key ideas or policy orientations. And that's true when we look at the general public survey. It's true when we look at the media kind of conversation. And it's true when we look at our climate policy data. So a fairly broad consensus of general public, kind of folks in decision-making spheres and in the media, that climate change is happening. It presents substantial risks for the region, and it requires kind of a meaningful response. Right. Secondly, there does seem to be broad-based support for renewables development and the idea that climate action can actually be supportive of economic growth. So that kind of green growth orientation. And thirdly, the idea that there is a very important role for provincial governments in advancing climate action, right? So it's not just left to the national government, but a recognition that the provinces do really matter, right? So that's the areas of consensus. That's, I think, good news for the most part. However, not shockingly, we also see areas of less consensus or more conflict, again, across our different kind of data sources and types of analysis. And those are mostly focused on the carbon tax and carbon pricing and limiting oil exploration and extraction. Right, that's really where we see the more less consensual, more conflictual kind of policy orientations, and so that's kind of not that different than what we see at the national level as well that I talked about, with both those areas of consensus and those areas of conflict. So with my last couple of minutes here, I want to conclude with the so what, and what are the implications? And I'm hoping that what you take away from today is that some of these research-based lessons might be able to help you inform, your climate communication and action in your own spheres of influence, and how so. How maybe might that work? And here I'm also going to channel a bit Max Boykhoff's book, as well as what some of the recommendations he makes. But one is that I think when we emphasize the more consensual climate beliefs and policy actions, we can take this as a foundation, a solid foundation from which to build social buy-in and advocacy coalitions around climate action. And I think that consensual foundation that we see in Atlantic Canada, and I think through a lot of Canada in the general public and the media conversation, a lot of the media conversation is that climate change is real, serious, and requires action. Also, that the renewables transition is generally seen as a good thing. And that when that's kind of framed through that kind of green growth discourse, which of course many academics have been critical of, and I think for reasons that we can discuss and that are often valid, but still that green growth orientation as a form of communicating climate action shows people how economic and environmental co-benefits might come to be, right? So it's not just an opposition between economic growth and environmental well-being, but we can kind of seek co-benefits. And that to me is the big strategic value of that kind of green growth discourse or way of framing climate communication. Conversely, we still have these less consensual or more conflictual policy orientations that are still really important potentially, right? But if we're trying to make progress on these less consensual orientations, we probably need some different strategies, right? So I think first we need to be thinking, how can we broaden out the existing advocacy coalitions and partnerships around some of these more conflictual issues or areas that are maybe more sensitive publicly, more open to debate in the media, all that kind of stuff. So how can we do brokerage and make new allies for these more, for pro climate orientations that are maybe more conflictual, less consensual. And I think a key thing here is also to be more open in acknowledging and trying to address the anxieties and barriers to social buy-in and to social support for these more conflictual policy orientations. And I think especially we need to be more attentive to the kind of equity impacts of potential climate solutions, the way that climate solutions may either amplify existing social inequalities or create new social inequalities. And I think, here through 15 years of data collection and analysis plus, I think we see, things like carbon tax and the carbon pricing or limiting oil and gas exploration and extraction. Those are important conversations. We know that carbon taxes have been working, like they've actually been a quite effective policy approach. So how can we build out more effective partnerships and advocacy coalitions, or how can we reframe these things and communicate about these things in ways that address the equity impacts, design policy measures that address the equity impacts, communicate about them in the ways that try to address people's anxieties and those barriers to social buy-in, stuff like that. So a bit, the strategies I think need to be a bit different than if we're talking about the higher consensus kind of areas. And I think the big risk here is that if we don't do this, opposition to specific climate policy orientations, we really run the risk of that specific opposition being linked to a broader climate politics of climate obstruction or denial, right? So we kind of lose the folks who might be opposed to carbon tax, but aren't necessarily opposed to the idea that we need to actually have some form of climate action. Right. And that's where I would maybe call back to what I said about social media becoming a real space of climate issue polarization and then aligning with other forms of issue polarization. I think we don't do ourselves favors if we kind of fail to be very sensitive and strategic around specifically these areas that we know are less consensual and higher conflict when we kind of talk about them and frame them. We risk maybe inadvertently playing into those tendencies towards the polarizing kind of discourse that we see in social media that then maybe trickles into our mass media as well and so on. And I would say that, the way we've seen the carbon tax debate blow up in the last year or two, I think is probably a picture perfect example of maybe some of those dynamics, right? Where it's been latched onto in terms of a broader politics of obstruction, whereas we don't want to lose those folks, right? That that maybe do believe that we need climate action, but just have real equity concerns or livelihood anxieties about what a carbon tax means in their lives, for example, just to take that as an example. So I will close it up there. I mean, I think right on time. I was hoping to end at 2:35 Newfoundland time, so that came in right where I wanted, so we can move that to some discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Mark. It was really interesting. We do have some time for discussion, so I would invite anyone who has any questions or any comments for our speaker, please just drop it into the comment section. We actually already have a few questions for you, so I'll just read them out. Chantal asks, I wonder if China's spike in climate discourse also matches with China's growing as a producer of solar panels and rare earth minerals, economic niche that gives them the edge over any other country stepping.
Yes, yeah, agreed completely. So I think China's a fascinating case. So actually, I have a PhD student who's just finished. So Yishi Yang, I mentioned on a couple of the articles I was citing. She's been publishing on China's real shift in climate discourse and climate politics, really since the Copenhagen COP meetings. That was actually a massive pivot for folks who study the geopolitics of climate change. If you look before 2009, China was often an obstructive voice in the COP meetings and in international climate policy debate. After COP, they really seemed to go. They went through this kind of real pivot, right? So they have this whole political discourse of ecological civilization. That's kind of the official discourse of the national government there. And yeah, I think that goes, very much this idea of developmental environmentalism. So really becoming going all in on green tech, on solar, on kind of rare earth minerals. Yeah, they haven't just benevolently become a super pro-environmental country. I think they've seen it as a place where they can actually have economic power, and then they've kind of branded it through this ecological civilization discourse nationally, and really completely pivoting the role they used to play internationally in climate debate, from the pre-Copenhagen COP to post. Yeah. Yes, 100%. And yeah, Yishi's work is great to look up if you're interested in that stuff, because she's studying social media communication in China on the Weibo platform, and looking at how that's been shifting over that kind of 15-year period of China's kind of their own green shift nationally.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
A next question from Obasanyo, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. Climate change, environment, and participation in international climate agreements are some of the issues moderating voting decisions among Americans. Definitely. Trump is already taking actions to deaccelerate some of the climate and environmental decisions made by his predecessors. What does this mean for Canada? Do issues of climate change and environment also moderate voting decisions?
So I think the speculation is really tough right now. I think fluid situation is a good term for our world at the moment. Like I said, I think for me, the tipping point where a lot of what looked like really positive trajectories after the Paris Agreement, a lot of the volatility I think started coming up with the war in Ukraine. So I do a lot of research in Norway and the Nordics, and so I do tend to follow Norway and Denmark and Iceland in my news feeds. And one thing we saw as a result of the war in Ukraine, was a real shift in the discourse around energy security, the need to secure energy from non-Russian sources. So that's where I think we started seeing a bit of a disruption of what had been a few years of really positive trends in decarbonization and renewable energy uptake in Europe and in other parts of the world. And I think Trump, as the chaos agent in chief, as he's already kind of come in as, I think, this month. I don't think that's me being too, punchy to say that, is further really amplifying that sense of volatility and disruption. So I felt pretty optimistic, I would say, in about 2000, around the time of coming out of COVID. I think I was feeling a bit optimistic still. I think that's been a lot harder to hold on to. And I guess the big question is, have some of those post-Paris Agreement trends, do they have enough of their own momentum now to carry on and persist in the wake of Trump's second term or not? And I think in the Canadian context, I mean, I don't know how this is going to go, but my hope is that it maybe will take some of the steam away from Poilievre's Conservative Party. I'm hopeful, based on the data at least, that there's a large majority of Canadians who, even if they disagree with the carbon tax, still want to see some form of climate action, who are still ultimately pro mitigation, who still recognize that this is an issue, and that don't necessarily want to see opposition to the carbon tax become just support for anti-climate action writ large. And maybe that's where a tiny bit of optimism based on data for the Canadian context. So
Thank you so much for that. Ulysses asks, he says, "Hi, Mark. I'm curious about what you mean by being sensitive around polarizing issues. How do you imagine that looking practically?"
I think, if once when we kind of know that there's going to be winners and losers from particular climate mitigation policies, I think from a communication perspective, just acknowledging that openly and saying, I think just that this is not every climate policy is going to benefit everybody, right? And I think we do want to, I think, just be open about acknowledging that. But then I think when we're actually having policy discussions, to think about, try to forecast what would be the equity impacts be, and try to mitigate them as best as possible, and then communicating clearly how those things are being mitigated, right? So, and I think people are trying to do that. I'm not saying people aren't. I wouldn't say people haven't been trying to do that either. But I think, the big sensitive discussions, I think, and we see this from our data going back a decade and a half now, have long been the issues around oil exploration and extraction and carbon pricing. So it's okay, we know those are places that people are going to have their backs up. So how can we communicate it clearly in ways that we, hear people's concerns, take those concerns on board, those livelihood concerns, those social equity concerns, and then, try to design policy that ensure kind of just transitions, or ensure that, we're trying to mitigate those equity impacts. Because I think, from our data, I think it's kind of watching the carbon tax debate go the way it's gone. I think it was kind of, for me, it was a bit of, oh yeah, we could have seen that in our data going back years, right? That was going to probably blow up at some point. And I guess that was what I mean by being sensitive around those polarizing issues, not just kind of pretending like it's for the greater good, so everything's going to be all right, or it's going to benefit everybody, ultimately, because we'll be addressing climate change, but to just acknowledge, right, that some forms of climate policy do have the risks of amplifying existing social inequalities or creating new social inequalities, and trying to really forecast what those are going to look like and doing our best to mitigate them.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. A next question comes from Anderson, who says, "Do you have any thoughts on climate change communication and action in the north of provinces in Canada?" There's a lot of focus on northern Canada, which is understandable, but it's not quite the same thing as north parts of provinces, and the way
Yeah.
forward.
Yes, we've done a bit of looking at media analysis specifically on Arctic media narratives, and that's probably the main, the interesting thing is, of course, we've mostly looked at national media for this stuff, so it's kind of the national news discourse that tends to be, I think, not ideal. I think it just, it tends to buy into a lot of the tropes of the North as kind of uninhabited wilderness, really focus on, but changing on the disproportionate landscape change, kind of stuff. But I think there's not a lot of more nuanced or complex discourse that most of Canada's carbon footprint is driven by the South and by oil and gas extraction and industrial production in the South. So there's a real disproportionality in where our climate footprint is coming from, and the Canadian North and the Arctic, which is disproportionately vulnerable and feeling the impacts, right? So this is one thing that I've written about a little bit, but that real disjuncture or inequality, when you stop treating Canada as a kind of nation state box and actually start looking at regional differences in responsibility, vulnerability, and impacts, and so on. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's, I think the piece we have is in the Canadian Review of Sociology on Arctic kind of climate change narratives about the Arctic specifically. And I think we tend to argue that they're not nearly nuanced enough, and they tend to project a lot of, kind of traditional southern tropes of the Arctic in ways that aren't necessarily helpful for thinking about those disproportionalities of responsibility, vulnerability, and impact. As for a way forward, I'm not sure I've got an off the cuff. I feel like that's a good one. Like sit down for a beer, or a cup of tea, and hash that out. Maybe, but I think that's at least what I've seen though in the stuff that I've done. I would say, yeah.
Thank you so much. So Johan asks, the noise and conflict around basics of climate change science has more people concerned, as quoted by Yale Climate Communication, than alarmed, such as engaged in solutions. Catherine Heo, a Canadian climatologist at the University of Texas, has focused on supporting citizens to engage friends, neighbors, and colleagues to talk about climate change in a local, personally effective manner, specifically to point people to local solutions that work in reducing emissions and creating community resilience. What are your thoughts on how we practically build our capacity to discuss these issues through everyday conversations on local concerns?
Yeah, and I think one of the good places to do that, and I agree, I think that's a really good, like doing that, because climate change can feel like a very high level abstract issue. So trying to localize it, get it, personal. I think one way to do that is to focus on co-benefits of adaptation or mitigation. So the ways that we can design climate solutions that just make our communities more livable as well, or safer, or like, address other kinds of environmental risks like air pollution, for example. So I think the co-benefits way of framing conversations is really good. Max Boykoff, in his book that I mentioned, he argues, I think, similar, like to really just focus on the fact that there is the scientific consensus, to really just to not spend too much energy trying to debunk our friends or neighbors skeptic beliefs or denialist beliefs, maybe, but to say, but no, hey, there's this global scientific community, and this is kind of like the core scientific consensus. It's happening, it's human caused, it's going to have serious impacts, and we need to do something about it. Like kind of the four major tenets of the consensus, keep coming back to that, right? If people, that's a pretty strong message as well. But to really focus on co-benefits is another way to do it. Some really fascinating work actually done by my colleague Christina Prell, who's in the Netherlands. So she's at Groningen, but she's from the US and works on field work in the United States. And she's done work with low-lying coastal communities that are predominantly Christian fundamentalist, who avowedly do not believe in climate change, that are like have kind of a culture of climate change is not happening, whatever's happening is an act of God. At the same time, these are communities that are experiencing firsthand inundations, sea level rise, like all the things we're seeing in low-lying coastal communities all over the world. So she's been doing some really interesting work on like, how do you get communities on board with climate action when the community as a whole is essentially a climate skeptic community? And what I think they find is really to focus on the adaptation needs first and foremost, and then that can maybe become a way into other conversations about mitigation, but to really focus on what the community is going to need in terms of infrastructure and adapt. And it's like, okay, let's just bracket out this conversation about whether God is causing sea level rise or anthropogenic carbon emissions. Let's actually focus on the adaptation conversation, because that's what we need to move forward, right? Yeah.
So Stephen says, thanks, Mark. Great talk. You mentioned the disconnect between the increase in climate change dialogue in media and the lack of change in policy. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, and I think what we see with our policy network data is that like there is a kind of like the more pro-business kind of bloc tends to be much more influential in our climate policy networks in Canada, whereas the pro-environmental bloc is actually pretty good at getting media coverage. So we do see this real asymmetry. I think the best thing to do is to probably try and broker more connections and more influence through that kind of emerging green growth coalition. And of course, with Trump in power, that green growth business coalition is maybe also feeling a bit nervous right now, but those actors are out there, right? Folks that are kind of so I think making friends, right, with the folks that are in the kind of the green business sector, and trying to build out those policy, those advocacy coalitions, those policy coalitions, to try to really work with that, use that kind of green growth shift to try to really reconfigure the landscape of the policy network to maybe, kind of counterbalance the fossil fuel sector, which we know is really influential, right? When we look at our policy network data. Similarly, when I'm Bill Carroll at UVic's done a ton of stuff on this as well. They tend to have a lot of influence, even if our media coverage tends to have a much more pro-environmental, environmental voices doing really good at getting things into the conversation, less good at kind of countering those fossil fuel interests in the policy networks. I would say, I know some folks are skeptical of the green growth stuff. I think, we need to make friends, and we need to be friends with the green business folks, and brokering those connections to build out our policy coalitions or advocacy coalitions, I think, is the way to go, to try to reconfigure those policy networks.
Great answer. So Chantal says, I'm glad social media was included in your analysis. What I find is that social media is where a lot of youth and radicalized people and busy people get their information. So a lot of people who also get tired of not hearing in traditional media voices empathy for their reality switch to social media for information.
Yeah.
The pandemic getting people hooked and down rabbit holes of polarization has made it worse. How do we get to all these people if we are not on the same platforms as them or in the same rabbit hole they are in?
Yeah, and that's really tough, right? And that's why I said, that's even in the countries we see, like in the cross-national spectrum, even in places that are very high consensus, very pro-climate action, social media really is becoming a place for the kind of polarization that we have long associated with the American media discourse or public discourse. And I think that's why it's especially, I mean, I don't know how, where people are kind of narrow casting through their choice of platforms. I'm not sure. I honestly don't know how we fight that, right? How we kind of mobilize against misinformation, disinformation, polarization. But I really do think that's the probably most pressing challenge for climate communication and building support for public buy-in, social buy-in for climate action that's in front of us. But I think gets at partly why it's important to try to recognize that opposition to a particular climate policy orientation may not equal opposition to climate action in general or obstruction in general. So I think that's where we also maybe need to try to have those more nuanced conversations, that it's not you're for all the climate action or you're a skeptic or denialist, that, that we can have more nuanced or complex conversations about what kind of climate action and what the impacts of those are. And, that we can maybe still all agree that, yes, we need climate action, and have maybe vociferous debates about what that looks like. But yeah, I agree that it's actually pretty depressing to think about the way that our, that the informational silos, the siloing of kind of epistemic or knowledge communities or communication communities, and I think alarming also, like that graph from Ted Chen's article, that the more that climate communication is polarizing on social media, the more it starts linking up to other forms of highly polarized, increasingly polarized issues around, immigration policy debate, around LGBTQIA plus rights, around Indigenous reconciliation. And I think it's extremely worrying. And I think it's not being helped by the kind of populist discourse we're seeing from south of the border these days. Yeah.
So we have time for one more question. If anyone has any additional questions, please don't hesitate to drop them into chat. We can share them with Mark, or you can reach out to Mark directly. So the last question is, thanks, Mark. How can climate change communication strategies be adapted for Arctic Indigenous communities, considering their unique knowledge systems and the challenges posed by rapidly changing environmental conditions? How can communication strategies effectively bridge the gap between scientific research and local decision-making to enhance resilience and adaptation?
Yeah, and I think this would be pushing me out on a bit of a limb. I think this is another case where this is probably a better conversation over a cup of tea or a pint of beer, to get into it a bit more broadly. But I think it's kind of some of the same principles of localizing the issue, the mitigation and adaptation needs, and I think really treating it as a dialogue kind of between Western scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. I think what we see in that Arctic narrative paper I mentioned is the way that the broader, kind of national scale media discourse often puts it. And once you read enough of these articles, they really start to look all the same. It's like there's an Inuit hunter who talks about how sea ice is changing, or the seasons are changing, and then in the next paragraph it immediately flips to the kind of the proper Western scientific kind of person who validates their Indigenous knowledge. I don't think that's the right way to go at all. I think that's part of one of the problematic things we talk about narrative, like Southern narratives of Arctic climate change. I think we need to see it as much more conversational, much more dialogical than that. And I think we need to see those voices. I think we do see that they're not very central to like the national scale policy debate. So I think trying to amplify those voices and concerns in the more national or even provincial policy debates, to keep bringing awareness. So I think, in Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, to keep bringing awareness that, like repeatedly, that Labrador has different issues and concerns and is experiencing climate vulnerability and impacts differently. Keep repeating that in the provincial level media conversation, in the political conversation, to keep trying to draw attention to that, and to try to get push back on maybe some of the more national narratives that, oh yes, the Arctic may be warming faster, but it's kind of this uninhabited empty space, which it's not at all, right? It is full of communities that are highly vulnerable and at risk and experiencing these changes firsthand. I think the average right now for the Arctic globally is that it's warming at 3 to 4 times the global average. And then that's even more so when you go to specific places, locales within the Arctic. I think was informed last winter when I was in Norway that, for example, Svalbard is warming at about 7 to 8 times the global average. So how those communities experience that, the vulnerabilities, the impacts, looks extremely different, right? Obviously. So yeah, I'd say for those of us in those communities, kind of making things local, having those dialogical conversations. For those of us that are in the South or in provincial or national capitals, trying our best to amplify those voices where we can, and keep raising those issues of those inequalities of responsibility and vulnerability and impacts.
So we're just about at time. So I wanted to thank everyone for your attendance, for your interest, for your questions. I also wanted to offer sincere thanks to our presenter, Professor Mark Stoddart, for your work and taking your time to share it with us. We will be emailing registrants a link to this recording along with the presentation slides in about a week, so keep an eye on your email. We will also be posting the links to those materials on our website under the Activities tab. So if you'd like to learn more about CORC, please visit our website at www.corccop.com or contact us at corccom@gmail.com. You can also check out FOCI's website for more information. We are integrated work package number 2, and you're welcome to subscribe to our communications list to find out about upcoming events, including at future webinars. The subscribe button is on our website. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation hosted by FOCI and the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah.